the environment around it would have been, what sort of references or forms it would be. And I went ahead and made the same city for my miniatures model, which has this huge dome sits over it, which basically cloaks it from the original world, so you don't know its location. On the board, I also have some of the pictures that were clicked by the photographer across. And I've been also working with another Japanese tale, which talks about sun goddesses, a place where the sun goddess went and hid inside the volcano. And she had this whole warrior community over there. So there's like this whole upside down Japanese town inside a volcano, which is still a work in progress. So it's pretty kind of amateur right now, but that's the sort of things I've been working on. And in terms of references or like projects where I position itself is like, as we see in the West world, there's this whole projection of the world that is not a real world, where you exit from the real world to go into this West world fantasy, or in Hunger Games, where you go fight for your rights of your district, or Westeros, which was basically a flipped version of Britain and Ireland. So I'm looking at this whole map or this array of phantom lands as a speculative realm of form and exploration of aesthetics, not trying to have an implication towards that this architecture or this aesthetic has something to offer as a future city or something, but it's more of a formal exploration in terms of a project or interest. That's it.
Okay, we can open up to discussion. That's cool. I'll mention that this is normally our moment for the miniatures review, where students are asked to make a miniaturized version of their final project, and then previous years we had an event in Hauser and Wirtz. So today it's not quite mid-review, so things are still very much in flux, and so today is more of a kind of general review, I guess a miniature review, if you will.
I mean, I can start. I really enjoyed the presentation. I think it's a really interesting setup. But one of the things that I wanted to maybe point out, or at least bring to discussion again, like I'm not sure if this is the point of focus, but this idea of fakeness and falsehood. So typically, like, I think the way that you were describing the Phantom Islands via hallucinations is in a way describing or making something up that does not exist, versus false or falsehoodness, fakeness, which is something that tries to represent something that is real. So I think it would be very important for you to define whether you are lurking in the territory of fake or false, because I think there is, there's a little bit of a difference that I think could help you bridge the sort of what I would call the kind of like the thesis narrative or the framework with the project that you're working on right now. Because I think, like, in terms of like the visual project or the formal project that you're proposing, I would like to, like, I would have wanted to hear you speak a little bit more about how this idea of non-truth, or the idea of making up something that does not exist at all, comes into play into this kind of proposal of these islands, I would say.
Yeah.
David, you want to go?
No, please.
Okay. Well, yeah, so I really appreciated the presentation. And I guess some things that came to mind, maybe to jump off of Viola's comments, would just really be the nature of the map to begin with, and how much authority it's kind of claimed or commanded in various points in time. And you mentioned the move at a certain point to Google Earth, and how that was, one of the first all-encompassing kind of representations of the surface of the Earth after the blue marble and things like this. So I guess I'm really curious what your maps are going to look like and how much authority they're going to command in the project. And for me, that's the sort of missing link right now. I'm having a little bit of a hard time reconciling these really amazing, elaborate renderings of the model and the idea of a model and the Google Earth model, and how like that term even operates in the project with the function of the map. And because we would assume that, you know, one of the ways that that maps operate in relation to truth in some way is that they're somewhat plausible and somewhat believable, or that they've been used to prove or disprove theories about things, or prove or disprove ways that things can move across from one point to another, or to in a way to structure logistics and flight paths and shipping lanes and all of these things. So maps become tools in a way, and I would really like to see how the map becomes a kind of tool to restructure our understanding of what's perhaps real and what's not. So right now, these renderings are so, at least for me, so kind of far from anything that I could imagine being out there in the middle of the ocean. And I guess I would like them to put a little bit more pressure in their aesthetic and their representation and their geometry and form, and on perhaps preconceptions of what we imagine coming out of the map. So because they're so neatly cropped and because they're so geometric, they seem to be constructed in a way and not necessarily emerging from something that's discovered or something that's coming out of these narratives. And I think an interesting kind of maybe promise of the project is that you could begin to kind of force the terms that you're using to kind of come to head with one another. So perhaps that through the project, you begin to define or redefine like what the status of a map is today in this like world of GPS that we have, and that, you know, we're typically not seeing everything at once, especially with like wayfinding tools and things like this. You're typically seeing just the road kind of right in front of you. So how you crop, how you frame, how much information you show at once, and how much that leads to us believing that these islands are actually out there, can actually be out there. I guess I would like the narrative to become something that you're very, very invested in as truth, as portraying some kind of, or suggesting some kind of truth, and that the models begin to be things, or the renderings and the images that you produce begin to be things that are on the edge of like fake and not fake.
It seems like representation will become an important issue for the thesis agenda. So I'm very much in agreement with you, Aaron, that if you want to go with the authority of the cartography medium, or way, I guess, format of representation, then like artifacts are probably not the way to go. But if the interest, it looks like it's getting more like away from the cartography and more into almost like fake archaeological artifacts. So like I posted in the chat when that controversial thing that Damien Hirst did, where he invented some fake shipwrecks and then he sold off the artifacts from the shipwreck as sculpture, you know. So like, I think that's another way you could deal with the real versus fake kind of reality effect of aesthetics. And but if I guess you have to decide, are you more interested in the cartography, like zoomed out view, or are you more interested in these artifacts and like sculptures? And,
yeah. One other thing I would say really quickly, and then I'd be curious to know, but is that I think there's also a lot of things already, especially in Google Earth, where the real versus the unreal, or the contested boundaries between things are various collections of data, like NASA Landsat, and basically Google Earth is compiling all these different sources of data, and there ends up being an incongruity in how the data is actually matched. So you get different boundaries drawn between countries in some cases, and in historically recent history, it's actually started a civil war in Nicaragua.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the extent to which you have to invent the fake is actually, you might be able to rein it in a little bit, and in order to recognize that there's actually already contested, let's say contested truths out there already present in a lot of these maps and map making practices. And perhaps that leads to some other ways to think about the kind of role of, or how to begin to kind of manage and design these forms in relation to the map. But it does seem like I agree with David that like the focus, especially in the presentation, because the maps aren't here, or maps that you've produced aren't here, that the focus has been mostly in these little models as almost artifacts in a way.
The Damien Hirst piece I thought was interesting because, he declares it's fake. It's Damien Hirst. And it's never intended to fool the viewer into thinking that this is an actual shipwreck. So, the aesthetic effect or the enjoyment or the mood of the pieces is the paranoia of encountering something with some kind of unstable relationship to fact. So I think how to cultivate that paranoia, I think, in the viewer, I think it's an important part of the direction you're going.
But to some degree, it seemed that the strength of the project would not relate to the tension between each specific island and the map at large, but the transition from each island to the next. So there's a narrative component in which you start navigating through this island as a way of collecting information to put your world together, but never in relationship to the large picture, but the relationship to the one that you just visited or to the one that you're going to visit next. And I think you will be playing on contradictions and absurdities in which one actually sets the tone in being somewhat conventional. And then the absurdity comes in the next one, in which it's actually completely different and unexpected. And you can start playing with notions of familiarity, absurdity, fakeness, or falsehood, in which you actually model some of these fairly conventional, then change them, and you start creating this roller coaster of navigation among the people who are experiencing your things. So it's very time-based and it's very narrative-based. But the moment that you position a map, you're going to implicitly start looking into the political layout of that map, where the island lays. Is it South America, close to South America? Is it North America? So I wouldn't be comfortable with trying to position this geographically in the world. I think it's more about the positioning in time between one to the next, to the one to the next. And if it's a loop, if you start creating loops or different trajectories for you to navigate, almost like a game, you're just moving from this world to the next world to the next world, being islands. It's almost like the enjoyment of going into Gilligan's Island, like watching that show, is that it was so absurd that nothing kind of like makes sense in reality, right? But it was only because we're comparing it to our own understanding of, like, let's say, mainland. But if you set the tone of mainland being completely different than the ones that precede that, you can actually create more of an impact. And I think what you're pursuing is creating that notion of absurdity or surprise as you visit these islands. You're not trying to create one cohesive kind of thing, if I understand the project correctly.
That might have been the first time ever I've heard Gilligan's Island referenced in an architecture review. Thank you for that.
I would also think about, maybe this also kind of ties into the conversation about representation. I would begin to think now about how you're going to present the final project, and if the intent is to kind of, if the intent is the Damien Hirst approach to present it as the fake and have a discussion around that, or if the intent is to present it as a kind of real discovery of these things, and you're imagining or reimagining or drawing on constructed narratives to move us through these kind of little worlds, really these little isolated worlds. And so I think like the Miro board and the object-like things might be more difficult to kind of access or experience, really, than the more immersive kind of renderings, or maybe there's a way to begin to think really specifically about the difference between the two. When you present something like an artifact that came from this place, and when you present something as like a sort of recording or documentation of having been at this place. But to me, it's unclear whether, I mean, maybe this is something that Viola was asking, whether you're interested in people believing that this is a real place, and your tone and your character in the presentation and the way you present and what you say builds that up. And so we have conversations about, and you don't like break that wall, or you present it as a kind of, as a fake narrative, as something that's constructed, and you're trying to ask questions around around these terms, around the power of the tools that you're using and the objects that you're showing, and or maybe it's a hybrid of those things, and you present it as very, very real, as documentation of a place, and then you kind of reveal in the end that it's not. So I guess I think that's something really important to decide now, both the position of your position, how you're going to present it, and also what tools of representation you're going to use in the project itself. I mean, I think video seems really important to move people through, whether it's from island to island. I guess I wonder if you need them all, or if it can really be a very kind of intense focus on one.
I would, just as a quick comment, I would argue that maybe it is like a very intense singular island as a representation of all the islands that you're thinking through. One of the things that I wanted to also encourage you to is to maybe think about this idea of the phantom a little bit more. And I think Erin was talking about this kind of like middle ground. So I think like somewhere between the like, I was happy to see that the project was not necessarily depending on like special effects in a way to sort of to build up on that narrative, or to act in place of a formal thesis per se. But I think I think like maybe occupying a kind of like middle ground between some of these things, so that you can further highlight this idea of the phantom, I think might be an interesting position for you to take. And then the island will have sort of like multiple things to offer depending on basically how you present it, how you occupy it, how you present to occupy it, and so on.
Thank you.
So maybe David,
yep.
a quick on my end. Since
okay.
Yeah, hears me all the time, so it's not so much a critic, but more a question to our distinguished guests. And I think some of you touch on it, but one of the things that she's going back and forth is how important you guys think is a multiplicity of islands versus one island, because that's something that we cannot settle in which one makes more sense. I'm not sure if one way or another is that important, but it would be nice, I think, for Yash to hear your take on that.
I think that the whole point of the thing that came out at the end, where he's using everything as an excuse for formal exploration. And so I think it really comes down to what sort of form are you interested in exploring to me? And because everything is a sort of a convenience to that, I agree that the phantom is the place in a way. That's the word that I locked onto. I didn't really lock onto fake so much, because I don't know, I personally have trouble believing anything's fake once it becomes this sort of reality. I see it on the screen. But to me, it's this sort of like weird liminal space. And it's about, the purpose of the map is to have an excuse for embedding some sort of cultural relevance into the whole thing. And so to me, it's like, what cultural relevances are you interested in bringing into the equation? And then what sort of formal assemblies or tendencies are you interested in exploring? And how do those two sort of systems collide, combine, and create something else? To me, I think one or two, but it really depends upon what sort of form. To me, you're getting something very different out of Japan than you are elsewhere, based upon what images you have on the screen. So I'm curious, like, what you're actually personally most drawn to and why. And to me, it's like, you're going to get the most meat out of where your heart is, really. So I don't know. To me, it's like, it is the phantom. And I would push it. And I think there's multiple ways to represent this in the end, but I do think that representation is going to be absolutely crucial at the end to sort of like, because David touched on it. There's sort of selfish goals of yourself, like what do you want to get out of it? But then there's the effect on those who view it or interact with it. And how much importance does that actually hold to you? Do you care? If you do, then I think representation becomes sort of caged in a way and sort of geared towards how you want that affect to impact others.
I think
Yeah,
you want
make
to
sure
go
you check
more,
the chat. Yeah, you have a lot of
go
comments
more
in the chat.
archaeological than cartographic. I think if you zoom out too much, and you'll get stuck making drawings, you know, from too far away, and it probably won't be the right format for the kind of formal interest you have. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry, don't want to fall too far behind the schedule. I have no idea how to pronounce your name, so I apologize in advance. The next student is Shatish.
Yeah, you can call me Bende, yeah.
Okay, Bende. Okay. You are
I'll
next?
just share my screen. Yeah, I'm next.
Thank
So
you.
I'm Bende, and I'm working on my thesis topic called Ugliest Architecture. I'll briefly just go through my thesis report so everyone gets an idea what it's leading to. In my thesis report, I've set a series of examples with iconic architecture, and I made a simple change in each of them regarding their textures, size, form, colors, shape, that entirely changes the perspective we see towards them. With reference to this, I've included with reference to Trump's idea of making federal buildings beautiful again. He considers deconstructivist and brutalist buildings being ugly, and he wishes to convert them into neoclassical style again. And China's reference to encourage weird architecture in its city. I would start with my design process. I started the design process by chalking down the list of elements that contribute in making a building: the doors, windows, wall facades, roofs, staircases, etc. Since aesthetics and ugliness is purely subjective term, I have collected different elements of a building throughout the architecture, inspired by Rem Koolhaas's exhibit called The Elements of Architecture. I then assembled them into a more cacophonic method with contrasting elements, forms, and textures being placed next to each other, resulting into a cacophonic architecture cacophony. With the reference of Trump's idea of making the federal buildings beautiful again by renovating and redesigning the deconstructivist and brutalist architecture, and a similar reference by Chinese government to encourage the design behind the weird buildings, I would like to propose this as a new design to the federal building Capitol in Washington, D.C. as my site. Yeah, thank you.
Short and sweet. Nice.
Yeah.
What would you call the aesthetic category that you're...
I wouldn't define it under any category, it's just an architectural cacophony. I don't want to make it deconstructivist, brutalist, maybe which doesn't include any of the forms or styles in architecture yet.
I mean, I think style is a tricky word. I don't think it's that, but I guess I would encourage you to get more specific about trying to define the aesthetic. So if it's not beautiful, what is it? What does, what does social media produce? What is that aesthetic? I think would be the question for me. What kind of new aesthetic are you trying to define here and put forward for, I guess, the next generation, and one that I would imagine would be open to not being able to be kind of categorized as a style, because style gets us into trouble in some way. So I think it's an interesting problem. I guess I would go a little further in the presentation for sure to talk about why beauty and classical architecture are problematic, why like how this for sort of civic or government buildings produces a new aesthetic. Well, I guess how this relates to an idea about civic aesthetic and like community, and how it doesn't need to be consistent from one like place to another. That's not what you're advocating for, sort of homogeneity, but quite the opposite. And so I kind of would want to know a little bit more about the number of recognizable parts, you know, how, who's able to kind of like read this, if you will. I mean, if the argument was somehow that like these classical forms are, I don't know, elitist in some way, is this more of the people's architecture? Is what is it trying to do? I think that's a really important thing for kind of you to articulate, and not just against Trump and classicism, but toward what then? And like, how do you describe it? How does it change? What are its kind of goals?
I guess when if the question of what it ends up representing over time is an entirely different issue from the procedure by which the author is making it. So for example, if Trump ends up saying, this is awesome, this is going to be the new federalist style, if it actually happens, then it would have the exact opposite association that you intend, right? So like to some degree, I think it's a little bit out of the hands of the author, like what ends up happening to the work, right? So like at that, I feel like it's difficult to speculate about, you know, but we could talk about the procedure maybe. So it seems like it's important for you to have lots of little bits. They're all recognizable on its own. None of the bits are generic geometries like a square, you know, or sphere. Like they're all figural. They all have a little bit of signifier attached to it. And then the procedure is to avoid any kind of, I guess, orderly disposition of how you combine them. You know, that it's important for it to be smashed together in a fucked up way, right? So
yeah, that's right.
maybe within that, you could develop some kind of criteria for saying what's a mistake and what's a right move, you know, regardless of maybe outcome and who it's for. So like, do you have enough pieces? How much signification do you need? Do you need a fully formed teddy bear, or should it be a little bit abstracted? Or how awkward should it end up being? And do you have 20 or do you need 2,000? You know? So I think maybe that's what I can leave you with today about just try to figure out what the rules are here.
Yeah, I want to pick up a little bit on the idea of the rule set. If this is, so I think like one of the things, and maybe you said this and I missed it, but one of the things that I've been wondering about is whether or not this is a kind of automated process, or whether or not this is a sort of setup for an automated process or something that will turn into an automated process, or whether this is strictly, I selected these 20 elements from these case studies that I looked at, and I carefully rotated, manipulated, and created this cluster, this type of organization of these types of units. And I think those three types of setups, or actually it's only two types of setups, if you think about it in a kind of automated process and something that you're manually working through, I think those two have their own implications. And I would say that I think maybe thinking through that, whether or not there is a rule set that is dependent on the unique individual who is placing these things together, or whether this is a very haphazard, randomized type of system, I think that will help you in a way clarify what we should be looking at, whether we're looking at the process, whether we're looking at the relationship that these things are creating between one another, or whether we're just looking at the thing itself and trying to come up with ways to read it, which I think is an interesting problem as well, which is something that we're all kind of trying to do, like what is it, right? So, but I think that's something that you probably need to sort of clarify for yourself in a way, because I do think that those two types of setups have a different set of implications. And I think that would help you kind of clarify a little bit more in terms of like what the thesis is trying to argue and what problem is if it's trying to solve a problem, but not necessarily in those terms. It's kind of, so to speak, in a way.
But the degree I think the project is clearer. I think it's too clear when I see the final product. It's just because in my mind, maybe it's because of my education and probably your education too. Like I immediately see Heatherwick, I immediately see Moss, I immediately see Gary, I see Coop Himoblo. I see very identifiable pieces in the model that you were not willing to name as a product. You said that it's just the compilation of all these things, but I think it's too readable, let's say, for at least for me as an audience. I think it's too readable, and I failed to see the value of these pieces coming together just yet, because they're mostly just three-dimensional. It's just geometric manipulation that you're doing, but you're not questioning kind of like the conceptual framework of each of those architects. I don't know if you produce this in that realm, but I do see it. I don't know if like I see Tatlin Tower. I know it's not the Tatlin Tower, but I see reference to it. I see Moss, Gary, Heatherwick, like very clear examples in architecture. So I don't know how strange it is. For me, I would want to see it even more strange when you start merging these pieces. And I think it's a problem of the discreteness of each of these elements operated kind of like without really trying to combine them. I think one thing that you can do is through whatever tools you're using computation, you can start blurring the boundaries between them. They're indexing color, the indexing geometry. So it's just like a puzzle pieces coming together, but there's not really any adaptation, mutation, or transition from piece to piece. They just collide together. So something that I think you should be looking at is what are the things that would allow you through geometrically transfer information? Let's say you're looking at architects to transfer information from that specific design of an architect to the next one, and your project is in that moment, that threshold between one and the other. And that's when you create that strangeness and that, let's say, ugly building, assuming that ugly buildings is something that we want, right? And I think it is, right, to be able to create contrast. So I don't think it's ugly yet in comparison to what a beautiful building is, being more like styles, recognizable styles. So I think you have to push it even further.
I think the ugly is sort of a red herring in a way. To me, it feels more like the perverse is a more reasonable sort of operative process to dip into. And in that sense, like I agree with Ivan, if I was hearing you correctly, where I think the pieces, the chunks that you're taking from elsewhere, I think you need to understand the conceptual underpinnings of them in order to mutate them, to pervert them, and then to subsequently combine them into some sort of overall system. Older reference, but I might look at Nancy Spector's intro to Matthew Barney's Cremaster. It came out a while back. Because it's about shutting down modes of production for something. And I think, yeah, I don't think the ugly is going to get you far. That's going to end up in sort of a non-productive, unproductive debate, I think, in the end. So I think it does come down to figuring out some sort of how you're going to operate. Like, why are you doing all of these things, as multiple people have already mentioned.
It feels a bit like your moves are all at the same scale. Maybe the next step is to start zooming in and doing like micro changes, like switching Gary's window with Moss's window, or adjusting the materials slightly to blur those boundaries more. I would zoom in and think about a different scale of operations as well, because it feels like a bit stuck at all at the one scale of carving.
So David mentioned something about the author, and I guess that led me to thinking about the opposition to Trump as the premise of the project, and perhaps a way, maybe a little curveball for the project, but perhaps another way to think about it would be to think about how to displace authorship in a way, so not a singular author of one building, but a way to begin to design a kind of interface or game in a way that allows people to, I mean, you're talking about civic buildings, and to not acknowledge the fact that like they're buildings for people, and the singular author is something that I think we're starting to acknowledge as perhaps challenging the position, trying to ask if anything is really produced in a singular way today. And I guess I'm wondering if there's room in the project to think about a kind of game or interface where you outline the parts and the ways that they come together, but a rule set for them, but you let people kind of design people. I don't know if it's just architects or if it's a more public audience design their own civic building in a way. So you kind of curate the things that they can use and how they can come together, but not the kind of final thing. And I think, I mean, I don't know if that's technically possible from where you're coming from, but it might help like answer some questions that for me are kind of lingering in the project, and allow you to focus more on this rule set and how they come together and less on the sort of specifics of the final thing and what it's doing, and that you can produce sort of multiple versions from a rule set of things.
Yeah, I guess I'm also thinking along similar lines, Aaron, because I guess that's why I mentioned procedure, like thinking in the late 20th century art history, when artists first started questioning the naturalism of compositional sensibility. Okay, we got to get away from our tendency to make it beautiful. All right, let's make something ugly, and like, oh shit, that too is a kind of composition. So like, how the hell do we escape? And the answer was to do it procedurally. You know, just take the sensibility out of the equation entirely. You know, so like, you have an artist like Barry LeVay, I'll put in the link. You know, you basically write rules for how to make a piece of art, and then you just do that. And that way there's like almost no compositional intelligence at all, you know. I think it's also went through a kind of history also, like it ran its course. And then what was weird was after all that, you had Pomo, you know, in art. You know, so it's interesting that I don't know, like if there's any possibility for resolution to this problem, you know. So you'll have to, I think, go through this proceduralism a little bit. It's just that I know that it can't end there. You know, it's kind of an inescapable problem that I designed it. Like there's no way out of that problem, you know. But yeah, you're gonna have to make it more absurd and more procedural first, I think, to get to that point. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're moving to Saleh's project.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. Cool. All right. We're gonna play this in the background while I kind of talk about my thesis statement. But yeah, as architects, I think we can move past criticizing reality and create our own. And for this thesis, I'm going to be doing this through aspects of storytelling that will somewhat, I guess, work alongside parafiction in a way, but rather than work on concealing reality within the fictional world as parafiction somewhat does, I'm hoping to operate a bit more chemically, where I can introduce real life elements that act as contaminants within the story and the world itself that I'm hoping to build. And I mean, I guess in doing so, I will knowingly and very obviously and shamelessly adopt cliches and tropes of the genre to sort of future speculations and science fiction and such. And I think as architects, I think we've been taught how to design. So I think I will hopefully be designing all the elements that at least will need to be part of the world or influence the world. And since it is storytelling, and I do want to explore this through animation, through video, the first thing I set out to go for was design the character itself. So the sort of time lapse that you're seeing is the sort of first step into the sort of helmet design, and then it goes into the clothing, which you'll see. But it's more of a way to explore storytelling a bit differently. I didn't want to really start with the narrative at first. I had the sort of very basic and vague thesis idea, and getting to the story was through design for me at least. It was I didn't want to fulfill a narrative with the design, but I wanted to sort of create it through design elements and have the sort of these elements dictate or influence the story, the plot. How can I tell a story through a character rather than environment? How can I have that as the driving force? And how much of it can actually be a part of the main story itself. Yeah, I mean, I'll just skip through this, honestly, it's just placeholders. But what I then did was, this was the start of my character creation and such, and just different variations that I sort of never really felt like having them at all. And this was the final take that I had so far, which was the miniatures print that I've made. And it was honestly a process of trying to really tell the story through this mechanism, through the helmet itself. And as I went along, the story developed through the design of this sort of helmet. And this is how I sort of adopted the tropes he sort of had to have a helmet. I went into the feet and the gloves and shoes because he kind of needed to have them. And clothing, this is the first iteration of this Astro suit that I wanted to have, and it evolved into a more grounded, sort of basic, more street-like attire. And renderings that I have of the helmet that I can actually texture myself, so I can actually tell the story through that and develop. And I think while doing this, I really wanted to put myself in the world itself that I'm creating. So I think this is the closest way I could do it. So this is me on the left, and that's the character on the right that I'm trying to rig. And this was a way for me to actually be a part of the world and actually dictate it through my movements, at least helped me really get into it.
Awesome.
And lastly, I have for you guys is a very, very short trailer. It might be a bit loud, so just bear with me, but.
Always overcast. Towers ascend and pierce the clouds. They open gates for them to move above the grave.
And that's where I'm at. So that was essentially where I got to, and how the sort of story finally came about recently, I think the last week in the narrative, to develop into this. And this was just a first test. So yeah. I don't know what to leave it at. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Is this some sort of avatar for you?
Yeah. So that's
what. A self-portrait of some sort?
No, I mean, I didn't have that in mind. I didn't know if it was gonna work, but it ended up being, yeah. So it's kind of fun to live a video game at some time.
For some reason, my favorite part of it was when it's dancing around. So it's like the contradiction of the aesthetics of the design of the actual mesh versus the way it's moving are just completely contradictory. You know, like one is hilarious, the other is kind of like hardcore science fiction stuff, you know. I love the parka, you know, and that's Canadian goose.
It's cool because
coat.
I agree with you, David, because I think it takes you away from the cliché. So you have a cliché, the aesthetic clichés of parafiction and science fiction, but then it's behaving like this happy character. So that kind of a dichotomy is pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe you should focus on that more. Like it becomes more and more absurd, you know, contradictory, you know.
I think there's a certain component of tracing motions or mimicking real life motions or real time motion also in such a way that you can have geometry behave based on those motions. And I think like the way that, for instance, like the clothing or the clothing, the way that the clothing moves, or the fact that the hands don't actually like rotate the same way. So there's like a kind of like level of detail at play in here also. But I think this idea of tracing real life motion and using that kind of physical phenomenon to then replicate it through this very abstract 3D digital model. I think there's something that kind of like weird sort of like imitation component, I think for me is a really interesting thing to occupy, and a really interesting way, in my opinion, to work with geometry. And this sort of like reversal of like, we know how to manipulate geometry, and you've shown us like how to manipulate geometry exquisitely in your character design. To me, these moments of kind of like elements of surprise almost, or like moments of the unexpected, whereby you enter some attribute components to the cloth, for instance, but then you don't actually know how that's going to behave once you translate that real data to the digital model. And I think that's really interesting for me. And also the unfolded drawings, they're super beautiful. I'm just going to say that. And I think for me, there's always some level of abstractness, but also legibility in unfolded drawings as they relate to 3D geometry. For this one, I think the legibility is a little bit closer because the clothing is a little bit flat and so on. But I think seeing the 3D sort of body move in digital space with those unfolded drawings, if you could even like kind of link through all of them, that would also be super fascinating to see how those unfolded drawings kind of change and alter based on the movements that you're recording from real life, and lack of better, more exciting words.
Yeah, I agree. I think I will be cautious to put that much emphasis into the sci-fi quality or perfection, like you're calling it, of this as a trailer. I think you want to play off more of that contrast of, if it was me dealing with this, I want to put emphasis in the design of the helmet and the parka and the movements. I would play it more like post-credits, kind of like bloopers that happen at the end of a movie. So you completely detach it from the narrative of the movie, but there's enough context within the scene that you understand it was part of a stage. There's a stage design to it and a prior narrative to it, and this is playing after that narrative. So you can still carry the aesthetic of the narrative of the prior fiction of the movie that you had in mind, but you're putting emphasis on the products, being the helmet, the parka, the stage design, and so on, without relying on actually that kind of like cliche or cliche of the movie being in out of this world or post-apocalyptic kind of environment, right? So that would be a really good way to detach those two, but taking the notion of a film and everything that is in its context and carrying it forward with bloopers or post-credits. I think that would be a really good strategy.
I feel like in principle, all known forms of representation are fair game for all of you to appropriate and pirate to do your project. So like you can do a thesis in the form of a corporate financial report, or do your thesis in the form of a novel or in the form of a movie. But because of the way you're showing how you model this, I was actually thinking to myself, can you do a thesis in the form of a crappy YouTube digital ZBrush tutorial? But do it with like serious content, like weirdly embedded in it, but you're following the rules of the representational format, and which is actually huge right now. Like the viewership of these weird episodes on YouTube, they get more viewers than the New York Times these days.
Yeah, that's true.
Can you just say like what the thesis is, or what your general area of interest is?
It is hopefully in telling a story or narrative that operates within sort of parafiction, but not necessarily. And I really am into, I wanted to use design as a driving force, and to design not just the architecture. There was talk about like designing specifically within this world and what I can design. And at some point I did want to design everything but download the architecture in a sort of opposite way. So it's a mixture of what I can do with design, but at the same time, how much of that I can introduce in storytelling and narration, essentially.
I mean, I guess I would say it's like super accomplished, like already. I mean, just really, really amazing. But it does draw on a lot of tropes, and it feels quite familiar in a way. So if the thesis and interest is about the potential of design, I guess I would expect it to pay off in the end. And I mean, maybe it is your interest in enough in a graduate thesis to make a really well done, very accomplished, very convincing short video. Maybe it does draw on some of these other formats that circulate through popular media and things like this. But I mean, I guess I would wonder, I was just looking at Hernan's comment in the chat about the dichotomy between aesthetics and behavior. And I guess I wonder if that space can be opened up more a little bit. And so right now, the things are still quite close to one another. And I mean, maybe a way, so I would imagine either this character to be doing really unexpected things, or to be behaving in a really kind of unexpected way, or for the materials to be, the simulated materials to be behaving in a really kind of unexpected way, or for this character to occupy various worlds and environments that we don't imagine them in. One reference that I would just throw out there, which might actually kind of be hard to find on the internet, but I think you could find some clip of it, is the Swiss pavilion at the Venice Biennale, the Art Biennale the year before last. And it was called it was a video that was called like The World in Reverse, or In Reverse or something. And the artist, which was a choreographer duo, recorded people dancing, choreographed a dance and recorded them dancing in reverse, and then played the video in reverse. So it looked as if they were moving forward, but they were really moving backward, and it did really strange things with gravity. And it took a while for you to figure out like what was actually going on and how they were actually behaving in order to produce this kind of representation on screen. And I think that there's something kind of in there in the way that, like, you know, bodies move, and especially because there's a direct link between this character and your body in a way. I would encourage you to like open that space up a little bit more into the idea of thinking through more like behavior in a way, as both a kind of something that's like very highly controlled, but that's something that can get kind of erratic in particular moments, and that defines, there's like acceptable behaviors, there's like etiquette and things like this, and you know, right now it's pretty tame or timid, and I would just turn the volume up on it a lot in order to create more space between what we expect this character to do and the kind of aesthetic and the environment and the narrative space that they occupy. Right now they seem quite parallel.
I'm thinking the same thing, what you're saying about the behaviors of the character, but also in terms of the behavior of the camera. Like, yeah. I just really want to encourage you to think about like the playful TikTok, more personal, happy camera angles, and not just the sci-fi movie trailer. So maybe there's also a dichotomy in the camera as well as in the character. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. The next.
By the way, Erin, I found the pavilion. I just put in the chat.
Okay, cool. Gregory is next.
Hello, hi everyone. Let me just share my screen.
Sorry, before that, is that the one, Erin, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. So, in a very general level, this thesis sort of revolves around two basic ideas, and that's senseless storytelling and architectural absurdness. The title is subject to change for the moment, but it's called Nostos, and it's basically a project in the form of a short film. It's a short film that tells the story of a man who turns into a fish and is trapped underwater and has to go through a series of underwater absurd architectural environments and sets and worlds in order to go back to what we perceive as some sort of reality. For this review, I kind of thought that I want to, since it's a short film, I want to do a table read with you guys and go through the script itself. It's about 6 pages, so that's going to take me a few minutes. So feel free to interrupt me. Don't feel like you have to wait for me to finish to ask any questions. The most important thing for me right now is to make sure that the story is communicated in the most clear way possible. I'm literally going to be going through the script. I'm going to read through the pages, and I'll be sharing some images and notes as we go through to make sure that the story is clear. It's going to be a hybrid of animated scenes and live action, hopefully. And the story starts with a character in its human form in live action. I urge you to follow along, and I might need some help with reading for some characters as we go. So Aiden is the main character. Aiden is a boy in his early 20s living in a small American town by the sea. He tends to look confused, not a talkative fellow. He likes to sketch and always holds a book with him. Aiden walks around the town's seaside shops and aquariums. He ends up sitting down at the stoop of a beach house, flipping through pages of paper and sketching in occasional scattered, jerky movements of his hand. Call me Aiden. I was born in a small world of big hopes and small visions. I enjoy the ocean. I enjoy everything that frightens me. I like ice cream, especially in a cold winter morning. I'm not afraid of ice cream. I don't have many friends. I am mostly afraid of them, but I think they enjoy me. Aiden drops his book and notes, walks through the yard, out in the street, and heads towards the water, superimposing the title, Nostos, as he walks in the sand. Once in the water, ankle deep, Aiden acts dizzy and drops down. He lies for a split second before a wave runs over and covers his body. The water recedes instantly to reveal his body missing, his clothes wet on the sand. A blue-yellowish fish with large fins flops abruptly on the fabric of his shirt before the next wave drags it into the ocean. So that's the scene where our main character turns into a fish. Aiden is transformed to a fish. It has a blue and yellowish, glitchy scales and disproportionately large waving fins. The fish swims in quick, sharp movements, lost in terror between hydrothermal vents and bubbles, quick momentary cuts. The fish surrenders and falls swiftly downwards against the dark, calm, and foggy blue background. That takes us to the first animated scene and the first set, which is the Abyss of Rejections. The fish lies motionless on the sand. It opens its eyes and jumps upward, swimming in place. Far shot of a fantasy underworld. A landscape of buildings, corals, temples, gigantic shells, and Victorian furniture. It swims towards a school of other sea creatures. They all disappear at his side, apart from one squid. So that's introducing our first character. Sally, do you want to help me read for the squid?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, hello. Oh, hello.
And you must be?
I guess my name's Aiden.
Hold up. You can't possibly mean... Do you know where you are?
I'm in the ocean.
Listen, lad, you want to get out of here. And you want to get out of here fast. This is no place for you. Not for anything remotely human. Whatever stays here from your world gets rotten, wasted, and punished. Swim straight. Your ungainly little swimming skills will probably take you a while, but oh well. Third reef to the right, at the ancient ruins. Find the oracle and ask the sirens.
The who?
Poor thing. Good luck, lad. I hope you make it out of here.
So the squid jumps away, and after a moment, the fish swims out of the shore. Third reef to the right. So that concludes the first set. The second set is called the Forest of Oracles. So this will be a sequence of architectural environments that will change from one to the other. The fish swims into a set of archaic-looking temples, column ruins, sea flora, still beams, and hardcover books. Murky and uninvitingly still. Small flows of bubbles venting in the background. Kelps swimming at the foreground. All right, the sirens. I just have to find the sirens. So that's introducing the sirens, which is another group of characters. The one thing about the scene is that it's hopefully going to be a green screen. So it's going to be a combination of animation and the sirens being played by actual figures. The sirens are 4 female human-looking creatures living underseas. They provide prophecies and wisdom to sea creatures sparingly and always to their benefit. Siren 1 pops her head out of a seashell in empty curiousness. Rachel, do you want to read for Siren 1? Or somebody?
I'll read it. Beat it, nincompoop.
I really need to find the sirens. I'm lost here. I mean, I'm not supposed to be here. I don't belong here. And you see...
Fascinating. Sister.
So I'll be reading for the rest of the sirens. Siren 2 pops out of a Greek pediment, lying on her back, stretching her arms like awakened from a long sleep. What is it now? You lost the scale or something?
I think our friend comes from the human world and wishes to be taken back.
Siren 3 and 4 pop out their cords from behind corals and the pages of an oversized book. Ocean heavens, not again. I'm sorry, sir, but we cannot possibly help a being as desperate as you. Not to mention, you're not even a fish. You're a fraud. You're a fraud, and there's nothing we can do about you.
Ladies.
We don't offer oracles to a living threat. We only serve the righteous ones. Leave us.
Ladies.
They all get quiet for a moment, and Siren 1 looks at the fish with pitiful emptiness.
There's only one man who can get you out of this, child. The king of the ocean, our king. Of course, he's beheaded and imprisoned like any noble being in our world and yours. Go to the ocean bank. Second sandhill to the left, right after the kelp forest. You'll find the key to the king's prison cell. Take nothing else. Punishment. Swim all the way down the vaults. He's locked at the very bottom.
All sirens look at the fish for a second before it's subsiding back to where they emerged from. The fish swims out of the shore, second sandhill to the left. So that concludes the third set, the second one. And then there's a very short one on the ocean bank. The fish swims alone into a landscape with scattered objects of value like coins and morals arranged in a stealth structure. It finds a golden key, tosses it to its back, and swims away towards the seamount of punishment visible at the background. So the last scene, we're almost there, is when we're introducing the king. The king is dead, and his head is alive and is locked in prison. The fish approaches a tall, steep sandhill with a large complex of vaults made of stone, weirdly reminiscent of medieval structures. It swims down the vaults, drops the key from its back, and simply flows through iron bars into a prison cell with marble floors, chains, Venetian windows, corals, statues, and a human head. The head of the Ocean King is on top of a pillar. It's the face of a man with white hair and a beard. He opens his eyes instantly in the presence of the fish. Hernan, do you want to read for the king, or is that too much to ask?
Well, Gregory, we have 10 minutes left for discussion. So I wonder if maybe we could leave it after the king says something, huh? I do want to hear Hernan play the part of the king for a second.
So I can, okay, I can like fast forward then. So there's a conversation with the king, and the king has some sort of monologue, and then I'm gonna read the end of it. So at the end, after having a little monologue, I'm gonna let it up there in case you wanna read it. The king blows a storm of bubbles, and that's when we go back to live footage. And Aiden, our main character, is back in land in what seems to be like real world, and that's gonna be live footage, but edited so that as the camera moves away from the familiar beach, the ocean town is removed, replaced by an array of absurd structures and high-rise buildings covered in corals and seashells. So we're sort of losing an idea of reality. And to wrap it up, I have a little clip for you. That's the short transition scene after he's transformed into a fish and lost in the ocean before we introduce the first architectural set.
I'm almost sure that you've had this conversation during thesis prep, you know, but you are aware of Rem Koolhaas's thesis project at the AA, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So famously, he did nothing but write a script, and then he had his homies produce all the work, you know. And it wasn't clear at the moment, but it became evident later. That was the whole point. He doesn't touch anything. He just writes the script. To some degree, I think the whole OMA body of work, like it was already there in his thesis project, you know. So it's weird to go back and look at it again, you know. At the time, nobody probably had any idea this weirdo who was writing the script would turn out to be OMA, right? So I guess in the back of my mind, just as a first response to you is what might this be about for you to decide to write a script, you know, for your thesis project?
Well, do you mean in terms of like executing?
In terms of hidden agenda and ulterior motive, like
Oh,
Like, what point is this proving? Like, why did you decide to do this?
I think I sort of wanted to rely on absurdity in a way that I no longer feel the need to use architecture as the outcome, but as the means to say a story. So I don't intend to use a story to produce architecture. I intend to use architecture to tell a story. And I guess that's what I want to make out of it, being able to just implement the knowledge that I have and reverse the process instead of you know, a piece of architecture being the final outcome. Allow the architectural mentality to be implemented on what academically we would call a narrative.
It almost sounds like you're saying, well, we build this elaborate thing and we cake it with all these narratives that are there to be read on some level. It tells a story. And so why don't we just skip that part and just tell the story?
I don't think we're skipping it. I think it's still there in a way. It's just not the goal of the project, but it's present.
Interesting.
What to you is architectural about the script, either in its format and organization or narrative or tools, or what would you say? What architectural conversation does it participate in?
Right. Well, first of all, the series of worlds are now in written form, which are super important for me in terms of like clarifying my work process. But they need to be designed, because that's going to be the next level for me to literally design those underwater worlds. And there's going to be 4 of them. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
I mean, you said that it was important to you, like in answer to David's question about why did you write a script as a way to work on thesis, or as the thesis, and your answer was you didn't want to produce architecture. In the end, you wanted to use architecture to produce something else. So I wonder where in the script we as architects can find the architecture. I'm like, in what form is it? Is it in the organization, in structure of the script? Is it in terms that you're using? Is it in, I mean, we typically wouldn't associate architecture with underground. I mean, perhaps one of the most basic things is that it's associated with the ground. So maybe that's a way, that's the thing you're trying to get to undo, in a way, a conversation about the ground. I'm just looking for, and I'm just projecting on the project, but I'm just looking for where, like, what's the way in? I think it's easy to say you want to use architecture to produce something else, and perhaps because you're trained in architecture, it maybe that's enough, but I would be looking for something a little bit more specific. How does it actually operate here? In what way?
Right. I think there's like 2 parts to the answer of this. The first one's quite literal, of designing underwater worlds and environments and absurd looking structures, combining almost like collages of Max Ernst, in a way of combining things from different historical eras into like a coherent set. And that kind of is based on design decisions, which will be on how we'll see the ocean town changed at the end of the film, which will be above ground, if that makes it more architectural. And also design decisions made in everything in the film, like the fish itself, the way it's designed, the way I decide to make things, but also in a much greater level on how we perceive the real. Because when I will have live footage that will be edited in order to look absurd, to me, it's almost a dialogue between what is more absurd. Is it the fake itself or the reinterpretation of the real? And maybe if we need to position it within a discipline, like, where do we stand as a designers? Is it more towards the real side of it and reinterpretation of what we know as familiar, or is it into what is completely absurd and out of our safety in, like, you know, uncharted waters of the ground. Like you mentioned the ground, but I don't see how structures based on the ground are more architectural than anything else.
It's just one conversation that, let's say, is well worn in architecture. So I was just throwing that out there as a way in. Yeah. I'm trying to understand how to situate the project. I guess I think you need to get much more specific about what the intent is or how to answer these questions, because I think you want to have a productive conversation, and I have no doubt that this is going to be incredibly beautiful. I would think more about the script, actually, and how you orchestrate things through a script. And if it's the role of an architect as a kind of managerial, creative managerial position, like how do you use this format of Zoom to like, can you like plant people in your Zoom room at the final presentation and key them in, almost like orchestrate them to read parts of the script, and you don't have to call on them, and they have like really highly curated virtual backdrops and they're like in your world, and yeah. you really think about that space more than this underwater world, which is important too, but I think to David's point, like what do you hope to get out of this? What's your role as the architect of this? I think you should begin to think now about the sort of final presentation and how the script, which you've invested so much in, begins to relate to that, and how you orchestrate all of the kind of characters in a way.
Mm-hmm. I can add a couple comments to that. Sorry, I don't know if we're out of time or not, but I would also, I mean, I agree with the previous comments as well. I think you do need to be a little bit more specific. It seems like there's a lot of things that are still undecided at the moment or still at play. And in order for you to move forward, like halfway through the semester, I think you need to narrow that down a little bit. I think that maybe one of the things that I want to point out is this idea of the underwater component in a way that might be a little bit too easy. But the reversal of that is what would it be like if the fish went through this journey in an environment that didn't have water, for instance. How would the fish like travel through, for instance? So I think maybe from your script, I also think the script needs to be a little bit more decisive in a way, such that it needs to take on the role of either, like at the beginning, I thought that this had more of a mythological appeal to it. So if you're going to do that, then do that. But another thing that I maybe wanted to point out is there is a kind of like subgenre or substream of cartoonists or graphic novelists right now that are creating these kinds of animations that are they're existential animations. If I can just like line drawing existential animations, and most of the time they have characters that are neither animal nor human. They're just these kinds of characters that just sort of like go through like a very quick short journey in terms of like some sort of like existential crisis, whether it's them not knowing what kind of figures they are to other kinds of questions. Like for instance, I don't know what the conversation was between the fish and the king, but I think I do think that you need something more specific in terms of the script when you revise that kind of storyline, whether it's more the two things that came to mind for me, whether it's more mythological or something that's existential or so on, or something else that I didn't see yet.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you, Gregory.
Thank you.
Justine, you're next.
Yes, hi. Okay, let me share my screen. Here. Okay. So my thesis is called Rabbit Hole, and it's interested by the issue of misinformation in our society. So now more than ever, and like especially with the crisis that we have right now and the pandemic and everything, like it has become really obvious that it's really hard to delineate what is true and what is false in terms of like what the media tell us. So it leaves us with like a myriad of versions of the same facts, or like small variations on the same facts, and it's kind of hard to know which one to believe and which one to follow. So my thesis intend to use the strategy of the mise en abîme as a way to explore the multitude of ways that a simple fact or piece of information can be transmitted or interpreted. So for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of mise en abîme, it's basically this idea of having some like something embedded into the same structure. So it's basically a reflective strategy where the content of a medium is reflected in the medium itself. So the most basic idea is like the photograph of someone taking a photograph, or like the painting of someone painting. So in the context of the miniature, I decided to create a mini version of SCI-Arc, or like a mini keg that was meant to be photographed and looked at inside the keg. So that was just like a render that I did. This is the actual model. So at first glance, the model appears to be pretty standard and like pretty similar to what keg looks like. But then when you get closer to it and when you start looking at the inside, you see that there's actually some distortion in it. So by strategically placing mirrors and renders in place of some of the inside walls and partition walls in the model, I intended to disrupt and extend the space as we know it and deceive our initial expectations. So these are just like close-up shots of the miniatures that I did. So showing again, like in the inside, depending on like the point of view that we get, we start to see different, the interior starts to unfold differently. So here again, so just by moving like from a few inches, you start to see different things appearing in the inside of the model. So in a similar way, my thesis will only focus on one space, which is also going to be the keg, and it will explore through the technique of the mise en abîme. So like with the technique of the reflection and the abatement, it will explore the plurality of realities contained within one space. So these are just renders that I did for like the storyboard that I'm creating. So through the eyes of the camera searching for truth that it will never find, the viewer will enter a journey in a space that is constantly changing, becoming more and more unsettling. So different and ambiguous versions of the keg are going to be sharing the same space and will subsequently challenge the viewer's initial expectations. So here again, so through the design of this animation, I'm hoping to touch upon bigger questions related to the way information is covered and the way things are transmitted to the public, and to bring awareness to the fact that looking at one simple information may very well lead to an infinite rabbit hole. So yeah, that's it.
So the keg, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's not something that most people are all that familiar with outside of the SCI-Arc community or people that have been engaged with the school. And I guess I wonder about that choice and how much the thesis, the sort of success of the thesis relies on the recognition of the space to begin with, or the ability to kind of like, of somebody that you're asking to engage with your thesis to key into these differences and inconsistencies and like whatever illusions or multiplicities that you're producing. Like what if people don't know it and aren't familiar with it and can't see the kind of like irregularities or whatever that are produced? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I think this has been a question. I think initially when I was thinking of the thesis, we were still in the physical space. So the idea of like doing the school itself and presenting the project in the school would have been like ideal for sure. And then when we realized that maybe the final project is going to be presented online or like through a different kind of media, the question of like keeping the space came to me. But I still wanted to continue with this just because I knew that like pretty much all the reviewers are going to know this space very well. And it's kind of hard to find one other space that is like well known by all the reviewers at the same time. So that's why I wanted to.
Yeah, I was like kind of thinking of the Oval Office or something that's been, I don't know if that's the best thing, but something that's been circulated through media.
Like the obvious reference to Thomas Demand is interesting to some degree because in his work, it becomes less important what it is a photograph of. So he does the model of the photograph, and then it's a photograph of the model, and then it's no longer important that the original photograph was a depiction of like the break-in at the Nigerian embassy. That what it becomes about is more the oddness of the photograph of a real space, missing all these details like the electric sockets, and you could detect little glue seams in the walls and things like that. So it becomes less about the original subject matter, but the subject matter is photography itself. And so all the photographers coming out of the Dusseldorf school after the Beckers, they then put pressure on just whether or not photography is a medium of depicting reality anymore. That there is a reality principle of the medium itself, and now we can fuck with that, now that we're conscious of it, right?
With the demand work, though, it's abstraction too, and the reduction of things that key us into it being a photograph of the actual place. And the Keck is already the whole building is kind of stripped and industrial, and I wonder how I just wonder about that, and that question about how you keep people in and set them up in a way that their initial register with the project is almost like yours, is your frame of reference, and then how you begin to break that down. And so if it's not something that has where there's a base, a kind of common ground, let's say, I wonder what the most circulated media image is. Like, what's the one image that's been like circulated through media the most? I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry, I cut David off.
Well, I guess I'm kind of riffing with you here, like, because I know, we've both been interested in this for many years now, and it's, now that contemporary art photographers have opened up this territory by destabilizing the requirement to take photographs only of things that are real, and now that's no longer an obligation. What exactly are the opportunities of this new territory? Like, what can you do through what we used to call photography? Because it's no longer what we thought it was. So can an architect use that now to do an architecture project? I guess is the question, because you're doing it within Thesis at SCI-Arc, right? So I guess one way you could do it is to just use SCI-Arc itself, or not. I mean, it could be anything, I guess, in principle, just as a kind of an apparatus for producing something, right? So I guess there are some obvious ways you could go, like you can construct photographic representations, or what looks like photographic representations of things that don't actually exist in SCI-Arc, but it just looks like it does now, because you're doing it through this kind of constructed photography, or just do alterations of it. And
I would maybe say that using more than one particular space might be, so constructing a series might be a good way to move forward. And the reason for that is because then you can start to sort of establish relationships between the units in the series. So Keck Hall, I don't know about the Oval Office, but maybe, because we would all recognize it essentially. But I think like selecting like a few different spaces and sort of putting them through the same process, such that you can construct a series, so that you can sort of start to also understand what kind of criteria we're looking at, or what kind of qualities you're producing. I think that might be an interesting way to move forward. But I'm also like looking at this, I've been to Keck Hall many times as an alumni, so I think that there are elements in here that even if I were to ever experience the space empty, which I don't think I ever have, the kind of the rendering qualities, lighting qualities, and all the things that you've kind of set up those are the things that I'm noticing the most right now, because I'm so familiar with the space to begin with. So I wonder if this sort of this very subdued, very subtle kind of set of elements like lighting qualities the yellow is not quite yellow. It's super clean in terms of like the edges. They haven't been scuffed or anything. All these kinds of elements. I wonder if like you can set up a kind of, or I wonder if like those are some of the elements that you want to be perceived more holistically rather than the space itself, for instance. But I would definitely suggest constructing a series. I think that would be, and it can even be a series based on the same space. But I think you need some kind of like permutation game whereby you can establish a kind of a language of qualities almost.
Justine, couldn't you have like a depiction of the 4th floor of SCI-Arc or things like that? Like,
The 4th floor?
Yeah, just the non-existent spaces, just completely speculative, or like the underground level of SCI-Arc, or the gardens, the vast gardens of SCI-Arc, but using like everything that we have familiarity with, to produce a kind of reality principle of these things that don't even exist.
Yeah, no, that could be. I think maybe like one thing to specify is that instead of being just like a series of photos, I think it's more going to be like an animation that is going to go through, but then like a sequence of spaces are going to appear. So then maybe I can start having spaces that are like, yeah, maybe like the 4th floor of SCI-Arc or something that is like a little bit more fictional. I think that could be interesting.
It seems important to go speculative with it, I think.
I tend to disagree, David. I think it might be the opposite. I think it's adding layers of oddities in reality, that what we would call reality. I think seeing the space without power outlets, like outlets for powers or light switches or things like that. For me, it's easy to recognize when they're photographs and when they're renders and things like that. But adding, and I don't know, depending on the audience that you're talking to, you put power outlets that are not 12 feet apart, but they're actually 4 feet apart. And there's an abundance of power outlets, and calling attention to the details that we would understand as an audience, or let's say architectural designer, that we know that they shouldn't be there, or casting shadows from directions that kind of like give you a sense of figures that don't really exist in the space. Or lights that don't really exist in the space that you can use through the manipulation of the tools that you're using, renders, photographs, filters, whatever you're using. I think what you're trying to do is to call attention to things that are not easy perceivable. So you're demanding a time for people to pause and examine whatever animation image you're trying to produce, and kind of like pick where is Waldo? Like, oh, I found it, and calling attention to something specific, right? I think if you were to go completely speculative, I would understand that it would be very improbable for you to produce something that is believable. So you need to play on this kind of calling of attention as a detail, an architectural detail, playing with lights. And I don't know, it's phenomenological in a sense. I think it's very like direct. If you can make a design with power outlets, their distance, their kind of like the shape of them, something that makes me understand that you're questioning kind of like positions, heights, light sources, and things like that to produce a different effect on the space as I would experience it in real life. I think that's what you're trying to do. I don't think that is a total alternative reality to what you're trying to produce. It really has to be focused on the experience and the familiarity that people have with the space.
Well, Yvonne, the reason why I guess my suggestion goes in that direction is because I think it's important to not retread the critique of photography that the artists have already done. So like, I think your thesis should not be about photography. So I think the challenge is to leverage it into a form of practice where you can use the insights of the artists in recent art photography as a way to do the work of architecture in another way. So I think there are many choices there. I think you can focus on the little, or go outright speculative, but I guess the choice is yours. But I think it is important to turn it into practice.
Maybe if I can add another comment, I added this link to Walter de Maria's truck series that I think it was like his last exhibition at the DI Beacon. And when looking at the kind of the thumbnails that we're looking at now, this series sort of like reminded me of the truck series, in the sense that what he did is he removed any type of detailing from the truck bodies, and sort of like kind of like repainted and refinished them so that they reflected lights even more strongly, and so on. So like I think like so this idea of like removing these kinds of details that actually create quite a bit of noise, so to speak, is in a way like forces us to perceive the kind of the effect and the formal component a lot more effectively than if all the details were to be there. So I think the renderings that I'm looking at now sort of like reminded me of that strange kind of like position of knowing a truck so well, but then like not being able to remember the kinds of like elements that have been removed from the truck, but being like sort of like holistically like transcending towards this like red shiny kind of car body.
It's a cool project. I didn't know that.
What if you, I guess I liked Yvonne's comment in a way that it shifts attention to the sort of support systems of an architectural space, the things that we typically ignore the histories of, and as anything representational at all, really. And you start focusing on those. And I guess just to pull another photography reference in, there's a project called Dutch Details. I think it was Douglas Hubler, is that right? Where he started from afar and zoomed in and zoomed in and zoomed in. Who was that? Ed Ruscha, sorry, of course. And I think that's, I'm still hung up on the requirement of familiarity. And even though Walter de Maria, if somebody has never seen it relies on somebody like knowing that there's parts of a car that like hold it together, you know, like it relies on some kind of common ground of knowledge. And, but I wonder if you can get around that, or if the thesis can be positioned in a way, not to say that it's not any space, that it's not to say that it can be any space and the space doesn't matter at all, but that you're not interested in focusing on the typically privileged things that we do in architecture, and that you're interested in these other things like the paint on the floor and the like that like has to do with some, I don't know, egress or whatever it is, or the receptacles or the bolts, and that you zoom in and you call attention, like you start zoomed out and you zoom in and you zoom in and you zoom in. So the sort of uncanniness isn't produced through necessarily just repetition of things that aren't necessarily repeated, or the addition of things that aren't there, but through the attention paid to things that we typically don't pay attention to. I guess I'm kind of looking for a way that like all of the ideas that you've presented come together around a thesis of why you would be doing this. Not just the sort of beautiful images that can be produced, or how photography relates to architecture. I think it's all there, but I think it just needs to be a little bit more pointed in its intent.
I totally agree with that. That's where I've been having trouble sort of busting into this, because I think there's a lot of directions it can go. Yvonne sort of got me thinking about how Kubrick dealt with set design on The Shining to create a state of unease through architectural situations that simply can't exist in reality, but they're so subtle that you don't really notice them outright. It's something that sort of like unfolds on the subconscious, like a window can't frickin' be there. The way that Danny goes around the hotel, Overlook Hotel, simply can't happen in reality, but it's so subtle that you don't really notice it. You just sort of feel it. But I don't know, like you can go a billion different directions. I think it's just about picking a path. But I think there does seem to be a consistent theme of delaminating reality. And I think it's just sort of how do you want to go about that? Is it in like a Greg Egan parametric city kind of way? Is it a Shining kind of way? Is it through like architectural detailing. I don't know, like pick a path. They could all be quite good.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Next is Theo.
Hi. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay. So let me share my screen. All right, so this project embodies layers of movement in architecture. From my early photography taken in movement through the digital painting, my whole body is in movement. Between the physical restraint, the human to the machine, and the infinite possibility of the virtual world, I'm researching a way of developing an architectural space where my gestures shapes its curves. So I've been working in virtual reality. So I would like to show you like some of my work, or like, I mean, like a screen record of my work. So on the back, it was like my photography that I took like while being in motion, and then I keep using them and try to keep this idea of like being in movement while painting in this virtual world. So that was like this idea. So I just wanted to show you like some passage of it. And on the other one, I was trying to move further. And so all those lines that you can see is it's several, let's say like digital painting, where I use those lines to create like section cuts of like an architectural space, and stacking them all together, like the way they come for now. I still have to research the way they go together, but it creates some kind of volumes. And in this screen recording, I'm like dressing up and try to interpret all those lines and following them, still being like standing in my room, or this space that you can see like on the renders, and I'm just shaping its whole form while like still being moving around. So I would like to share with you also this model that I upload, that you can experience more or less the way I had this interaction with the virtual space. So I just put a link on the chat so you can open this Mila notes and like play around the model and zoom in and feel the spaces and like experience it at different scale, from like a model scale to one-to-one scale volumes. I mean architecture.
Oh. I have to register.
Oh no. Okay, but let me try to show you. So can you all see the model? So the whole idea is like being in this space, I'm changing from like being inside, and I feel the whole volumes around me because I'm submerged by this whole architectural space, and I can like move around and like feel like that I'm actually like on some kind of like corridor, or just like being like away very quick, and all of that like being in some kind of like workspace, but with an infinite dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, sorry. And so again, can you still see my screen? No.
Not anymore.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and here on the video, so you can see more or less the process, where maybe it's a little bit too fast, but I slow down at some parts. But you can see like now I'm in the architectural space, and I will like zoom out and like add some detail or get closer and like be more intricate. So it's, yeah, so on what I'm working.
So if I understand this right, the interest here is designing form while you're inside the space. So it's
or
like
outside, but
okay.
with the with the rich
in a kind of immersed reality. So it's not, it's kind of leaving behind a kind of orthographic kind of God's eye view way of delineating, but you're kind of always in it or away from it. Or,
yeah.
Cool. Is there anything you could say about what feels different to you now that you're the one actually doing this? You're the one having experience doing that. Could you tell us a little bit about what's it like? I've never done it, you know, so I'm curious what it feels like to design in this weird way.
So it's like a new software, first of all. So, but it's becoming really natural because we all draw, right? But now all of a sudden I'm doing those sketches and drawings.
I almost imagine it being like an architect that's graffiti artist, like you're spraying on form, you know.
There's like, as you can see here, I start in 2D on the first video. And those pictures that I made, I just like try to feel like those motions. So I'm like in between this whole space behind me and like try to, I mean, this is like some kind of like an enclosure. So I try to work around, and sometimes I just like hit a wall. So I kind of lose the sense of, because here you can see on the back, not now, but like you can see that this is a whole white space, right? But I'm still like restrained in this physical world, like, which is this one. You can actually see like the sensor. And I think you can, you at some point lose the fact that you're in a physical space, because, or you lose the code of it. You know that there's like a table, you know, like there's this door and so and so. And so the fact of creating in that world, I guess, bring like another dimension, at least to me, where
I guess I'm imagining doing it, right? And as I'm in the space with the goggles on making form, I could be in a situation where I love what I just did. It's like, that looks awesome. But then when I actually export the model and look at it in Rhino, it's like, I'm horrified by what it looks like in plan and section. You know, like, my God, what the fuck? Yeah.
I think if I can sort of pick up on that a little bit, this project is super, super strange. On the one hand, it kind of calls on this weird empathetic exchange between your own body as the creator of the architectural form. I think it's something that, like in the art discourse, for instance, like it's sort of like come back like again and again and again, this idea of like how our bodies sort of relate to artwork, for instance. So this maybe also you can relate it to like video games from at the time when video games went from a sort of like top view, sort of like planar view, to a first person perspective or first shooter perspective and so on. So I think you're calling certain kinds of mechanisms that exist in peripheral disciplines. And I think in that sense, like that makes this, for me, a very interesting project in terms of how you're calling those kinds of mechanisms. But at the same time, like it would be difficult to talk about the work alone strictly based on those types of mechanisms, because I think there are, you can't ignore the gestural component of it. So to me, like, I think I'm trying to kind of, to maybe see if I can relate this kind of empathetic sort of visual dynamics, first person modeler, I don't know what else to refer to it as, in relationship to the outcome. And I'm trying to, and like maybe a good question for you is, what are you more interested in? Are you more interested in this kind of mechanism that you've built? Because I don't want to call it a workflow, because to me it truly is a kind of like internalization mechanism, sort of. Or are you interested in these kinds of like 3D squiggly lines and like the sort of planes that you kind of like repeat over and over again to create some idea of implied form and so on. Like, are you more interested in the formal or figurative aspects of what you're generating, or are you more interested in this, what is the relationship between the person waving a hand with a headset on, and like how those kinds of things change from one person to the next, or from the day that that person is having to like a different kind of like day that that person is having?
Did you make this software?
No, this software is called Tilt Brush.
Okay. And you use it in what kind of like environment? Is it its own environment, or is it in like a gaming engine, or what is it?
Oh, actually, it's made by Unity.
Oh, Unity. Okay, great.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
not the same company, but like I think it's Google using Unity
Okay.
to develop Tilt Brush.
So I guess one way I've been thinking about how to situate the project would be a conversation about the relationship between tools and expertise. So architecture has, and a historian could speak more to this, but architecture has, we've seen changes in architecture with the introduction of new tools, changes in form, changes in representation, changes in aesthetic, and you can mark those changes. And I think one way in to begin to discuss the project would be in terms of asking what are the forms of architectural expertise today, and is knowledge of software one of them? And if so, or can knowledge of software be considered one of them? And if so, how does that begin to reshape architectural knowledge and expertise? So the way that sort of David brought up the fact that if you brought this into Rhino and were able to draw plans, that it not only would it be like a horrible building, but like, I don't even know that we could make the distinction between like a wall and a ceiling and a floor. And so as architectural expertise proliferates, how does software begin to factor in? So are you becoming a software expert in this? Are you still considered a software amateur but architectural expert? And how do you begin to kind of have a conversation about the ability to kind of like select, control, and refine the sort of most innovative and, well, popular software in a way, or populist, let's say. Unity is used to produce like worlds that the kind of average consumer can engage in. And I guess I wonder if there's a way to begin to bring in some of these environments, like the rendering environment that's so powerful in gaming engines and things like this, into this scene. And so the conversation is less about like, is this I don't even know what it is. Like, it shouldn't be that. It should be like, what is the implication of using this tool? And does it really just produce things that look like this? Or is this a new aesthetic, a new form? Are architects really just software amateurs using things, or does now architects need to become software experts? And do we begin to redefine the kind of like knowledge that we have, I guess? So I would try to set it up in a little bit of a more pointed way.
Aaron, like given the current critique of orthographic intelligence, and all the baggage that comes with it, maybe there's some potential to make a kind of opposite argument. We all know like the things that look great in Planet section orthographically that ended up looking like shit in perspectival experience. So like maybe the opposite could be interesting. Something that is like in fact going to be completely irregardless of orthographic compositional beauty, but in person, like in the space, it's kind of cool, So like I would think it's important that in the experience of having done it, like as you're looking at it, it looks great, or you can stand behind it in some way, and then the fact that it looks horrible orthographically is interesting.
David, it might be, I don't know what you look like. The whole thesis comes out too much of a sales pitch for a software platform, right? But what I think is interesting that you can actually extrapolate on is the relationship of movement to some kind of three-dimensionality. I'm kind of sure that you probably look very silly modeling this on your own bedroom, going around doing this kind of behavior. But if you were to match this to ballet dancers, to sports, and try to visualize the three-dimensionality of their movements, something that is highly choreographed, as a way to kind of like extract information in the relationship of the movement of a designer, how that translates into a 3D object, 3D space, might be a good way for you to set up that. I mean, it kind of like relates back to the sketch of an architect. Like that had a lot of value when an architect would sit on a table and do a napkin sketch, right? Because there was something related to the movement of the wrist, the way that the person was narrating the story, what they were like sketching for someone else. So I don't think that you're either an expert in the movement or that you're an expert trying to build, or you have enough expertise about producing the form. You're looking for a specific form. So you need to set some kind of parameter or standard for what qualified, let's say, it might be elegant, precise, or something like that. And you might go outside of architecture to look for those things. So if it is about movement, think about fields that actually choreograph movement very, very, very precise, and how that translates into three-dimensionality. And then you can say, for example, you put an architect and give them this and say, design a very simple house. It would really look like someone just drawing with chalkboard in the floor, right? So those are completely different, and you want to be somewhere, I guess, in the expertise mode, in which you can actually like look for motions and certain patterns that don't rely on kind of like the clunkiness of it, right? So I think it has a lot of potential, but you need to relate it to something that I can understand beyond just like sketching in 3D, because I'm familiar with the software and I understand how it operates, and it kind of like stops there.
What if you related it to the history of spline drawing? So, I mean, splines used to be things that were laid out on the floor in the attic for shipbuilding, and like people would be on, like it was one-to-one, it was very bodily. It was done with like full scale template kind of things, and those little ducks, I think they were called ducks, were used to position the curvature of the spline. And are you producing this at one-to-one? Is that right?
I don't even know what that might mean.
Like
if
I make a circle with my arm, and that's like I don't know, 3 or 4 foot diameter, 3 foot probably at most. Am I making a 3 foot circle in your software?
So the idea is like I can change the scale, like it's natural. I can be like either.
I think it should be one-to-one. I think you can position it in relation to the splines. Even Gary's easy edges or gestures at gestural things at one-to-one. And I'm also thinking about like Jean Nouvel walking around these full-scale mock-ups and like designing in the mock-up. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to position it in relation to conversations that are and have happened in architecture. And I think you need to figure out how to do that and shift it away from like you and your personal experience of what you did and how you did it. And as a way to open the conversation up a little bit more, I think it's super interesting. And I totally agree with David, like the thing in the end really needs to there needs to be payoff there. Like it needs to be beautiful and amazing,
it shouldn't be
plan
like
isn't
playing with software the whole time, right? Like all right, you did the playtime, just to get a feel for it. Now I think you need to develop some agendas for how to do it, you know. Interesting in game design, there's also orthographic games, right? And like there are games in axonometric, and then you have the first person shooter, right? And then the environments end up being designed differently for one or the other.
I mean, I wonder if even going as far back as like the early 1900s, experimental psychology, and the guys that were talking to the guys that were teaching at the Bauhaus, and how they started to think through pedagogical exercises that were based on kind of like bodily feelings. And during your presentation, you even said like, it feels like this, it feels like that. And I was really kind of like struck by how many times you use the word feel, which is something that I haven't heard in a really long time in an architecture presentation. So I don't know, I think for me, there's a lot of potential in this project. And yeah, maybe just spending an afternoon like reading up on Theodore Lips and like Paul Clay's like pedagogical exercises. But I think, and maybe actually one thing to sort of like backtrack to would be if you set up like a series of exercises for yourself, such that, you know, you set up kind of like restrictions, like what would this space look like if you use the exact same movements, but you were sitting down, or if you were sitting on a chair, or if you were lying down, like how does that sort of like body position with the architecture that you're creating? Like what are those kinds of relationships, so that you can start to understand that and then learn from that kind of process, and then produce something with an like it was mentioned earlier, with an agenda and so on.
Great.
It's definitely also something to do with the interface of the software. Like it often has these fake clouds and a ground in it to kind of keep you oriented. And I did one day where I turned that off and I got sick in like 5 minutes. So I think you have to be really careful about how you set up the background and the orientation within the room in the software. And there could really be an argument there for, you know, perspective, space, ground, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like you need a horizon, basically.
Yeah, all of them that I open have these weird fake clouds and like a brown ground. So,
you know, also like I mean, maybe more academically speaking, like English picturesque garden versus the French formal garden was a difference that I always found very interesting. Like French formal garden looks great in plan, but then like in person it's like just flat and whatever. And then the English picturesque garden, all right, they're trying to reproduce this famous landscape painting and placing things just to recreate that feel of what it's like to step into the painting. And then in plan, English picturesque gardens look like crap, you know? So like that plan becomes totally secondary, or the orthographic becomes secondary, you know, to being there. So there might be something there for you, you know, just to shift emphasis. You know.
Just a quick comment based on the last comments. I think what you're talking, David, I think it refers a little bit what Eric was saying earlier, which I put there in the chat, Theo, for you to think about it. In a way, you're flirting with kind of a perennial problem, at least I would call it, in the last 30 years in computers and all that, which is the negotiation between the role of the apparatus of the technology and representation and the relation of expertise about that and how it goes back and forth. And I think what David is talking about, the English garden and the French garden, is an interesting problem, which is the idea in which maybe there maybe should be a third garden in which it does both. So, I mean, the question is sometimes, where do we put the premium? Is it the representation of something or the thing itself, or it should be both? And I think in the territory you operate in, with the apparatus you operate in, I think the goal should be try to achieve both. Even though it may not be doable, I still think as an hypothesis, I really think that's a nice problem to corner yourself in it and see how you can find your way out of it.
Well, I guess one way you could do it is you could also model something in a traditional way, orthographically in Rhino, and then embed the orthographic and the virtual first-person model within each other, you know? So you have both, you know? So yeah, that could be interesting. I'm sorry, we have to move on, but you want to make a last comment there?
I think if it's going to be about expertise, another way in would be to say that these softwares are being used today and are more engaged than architectural softwares today. Like the expertise has shifted in a way, and popular like gaming platforms are things that a larger audience is accessing. So if we can use those same softwares and produce architecture in those platforms, I don't know where I'm going, but like, does it make architecture more consumable, more popular, more accessible to a larger audience? What is the implication, I guess, of using this platform?
Yeah, you should see how quickly my 12-year-old son models within Fortnite, just constructing things. Like it freaks me out actually seeing him do this. You know? But in these new gaming massive virtualized environments, there is some kind of design being brought to everybody in a really bizarre way. You know? Yeah.
But I would argue that one of the most interesting things about those elements is those platforms not yet allows us to hijack it to what is usually the default in architecture, which is to elevate the sophistication of it. So I like the idea that you had to deal with a certain kind of reductive, primitive repertoire. So I think there is something really interesting about the sophistication of the technology, but not so much the sophistication of the outcome. So I wonder if there is something there, which eventually we will domesticate and we will figure out a way how to produce expertise and sophistication, and then we will move on to the next one. So it's a strange, in that sense, it's very strange. For those who are older, it's like the first time that somebody recorded an album with a Moog Liberation organ. That it seemed like a very innovative thing, but after 2 songs, it became incredibly annoying. So I always intrigued by how architects we always feel like we had to move on into a new platform that it forces us to start from scratch again. But I think that's a cool thing. I think that's how pockets of innovation can happen here and there. So
yeah. Great. Thank you, Theo.
Thank you very much.
Caleb, you're next.
All right. Hello, everybody. I will share my screen.
We have Caleb and one more, and then we're done.
All right. So I don't yet have a full title for my thesis as a whole, but I've titled the presentation for today, Exploring Architectural Image Creation. And I think it's very interesting that I'm going right after that last conversation, because a lot of the topics that were discussed are things that I'm looking at in my thesis. So I'm primarily looking at the tools that architects use to create architectural representation, meaning rendering engines, and tools within those rendering engines that allow for certain aspects of a design to be created in ways that more traditional modeling softwares do not allow. And the 2 that I will be talking about today are proxy rendering and image-based material creation. And so to start, proxy rendering is a technique that is used to replace either a complex object or really any object within the 3D modeling software with a representation of that object until the time that the scene is rendered. So here you have a forest with a river flowing through it, but then what really is creating that image is a series of symbols that are turning into the trees at the time of render. So what's stated on the left, or on the right, sorry, is what is seen in the modeling software, and then the rest of the image is what you're actually producing. And then some more examples of this are going forward. Each of these lines on here on the left side of the screen represent the grass or the rock in the scene, but those objects, the individual grass and rock objects can easily be replaced with a series of buildings, or even these building forms as well. And the ability to create a massive amount of objects scattered throughout a scene, as well as being able to interchange them very quickly and easily, is something that really interested me in the creation of the architectural images. And these tools can be used on the scale that you're seeing here as like creating an urban scene, or even going down to the like tectonic of a building, or the scale of a blade of grass as seen in the previous images. So here are the three together, and these were all created from the same proxy rendering system. The second technique is what I called image-based image-based material creation, where you can take any image like this grayscale image on the left and create a full architecture from it. And so each of these grayscale pieces of this image correspond to the displacement of the surface, meaning it gives it depth, as well as the organization of materials to make it appear as an actual building with windows and balconies. And then that can be applied along with the proxy scattering technique to create an entire city. And so now I'll go through some of the other images that I've created along the way. I'm using these techniques to create just different architectural scenes currently with a combination of nature, architectural elements, and just the general elements that a renderer typically is used to make realistic architectural images, but then also mixing it with the ability of these tools to create completely absurd architectures or images. And the rest of these images are all using the same two techniques that I just explained. And there are various explorations of the possibilities, limitations, and general abilities of the tools. And this last slide is 60 of the almost 80 images, I think, that I've created since the beginning of the thesis semester. And now I'll open it for discussion.
Well, maybe I start. I enjoy, Caleb, what you're working on. I think it's to me, it has a couple of really interesting things. A couple of things I will suggest, and this is have to do more in the context that it is a thesis. And I was thinking when you were talking about the images and all that, I always and again, this is maybe has been floating around in academia for a long time, but it's interesting because when we used to draw by hand, there was not so much conversation about the line or this or that. It was about whatever the architecture was. So one thing I will suggest to you, and particularly in the context that we operate in right now with the COVID crisis in Zoom and so on, I'm not so sure you need to put so much emphasis in the notion of the image. I will talk more about you're making these architectures, and you're just having to use the tools and the methodology that you're using. So there is a central interesting thing about there is a huge array of options and aesthetics and prosaic architecture implication in each of those images. I mean, there is a lot of diversity in the pieces that you're creating. So I wonder if there is something to be said about that, this notion about the possibility of the multiplicity of creation of architecture in multiple times. And again, of course, we are all communicating through images right now. So I'm not so sure if I would put so much premium in that argument. I would be more curious to talk about, if I were you, the way I see it, I see your thesis and your project as profoundly architectural. I don't know if this relates to what we were talking about earlier with David and Erin and other ones, and Viola, I think too, about the photography and Thomas de Man and all that. But I think in your particular case, I don't think the technique and the expertise is the forefront of your project. For me, it's a possibility to create multiple outputs of architecture, logics, effects, project, however we want to call it, and that they are they are operating in the way that, like, I don't know, I was thinking in old times with the Basswood model or whatever, something like that. You know what I mean? There will not be a lot of conversation about the Basswood or the material, the model. It was a conversation, this is architecture I'm working, and this is the medium that I have. So I think in some other theses, I think the medium is more, it has a more central role. I think in yours is more about architecture as such, and I think that's part of the redefinition of what that means. And again, maybe I am heavily affected and influenced by the fact that we're doing this conversation through Zoom. So it's a very different effect if we were in a physical space and you will be putting drawings and renders or animation in a monitor or whatever. Here there is this kind of ambiguity that I think if I were you, I would play it in my favor. Like I will talk about like, and this kind of over-ambitious architect producing boom, 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 all these versions of architecture. And I think then if you can start to cataloging or qualifying what is the value of one versus the other one, because again, there is a huge array of the outcome that you're producing. And I'm fascinated by that. And I'm not saying that they don't have judgment. I'm pretty sure you're curating them, but they're very, very diverse. So there is something really interesting about that. I'm not giving you any solid advice or any clear path, but the one I keep thinking is, I don't know if you need to talk so much about image. I will talk about architecture and whatever that means today.
Alan, do you think there's a way for him to take advantage of just the diversity of architecture that he's been exploring? Or do you think he should start narrowing into some versions of this?
No, I think the diversity is interesting because I think it presents a different conversation with our field. For better or worse, in places like our school, and I think the schools and pretty much everybody's involved here, we always tend to premium in what I would call it, I mean, we don't like the work style, but we put a premium in coherency. So the idea that, usually if you create diversity, you belong to a different kind of part of the jungle of architecture. But I think that would be something to be questioning. Like there is an idea that this kind of a massive diversity can build a coherency that rely on other values than just aesthetic or formal or geometrical thing. So I think it's an interesting possibility. I mean, this is something that another field or in other creative fields is less of an issue than in architecture. You know what I mean? Like if you move into film or to fashion or something like that, you know, like I don't know, if you're Christopher Nolan or you're Spike Lee, you go from doing a heist movie to then do a biography of Malcolm X. If you're Christopher Nolan, you're doing Dunkirk, and then you were doing Batman. And everybody's okay with that. And architecture is the one that we always feel like, whoa, we get a little bit nervous about it. So I don't know. I'm not sure, Caleb, if you were setting up your thesis for that, but to me, that is a kind of an interesting byproduct that starts to emanate about that. I really think I will go as with diversity, and I don't know, I imagine the final review almost like an Instagram version of architecture is so oversaturated with options that at some moment you give up and say, okay, you're great, I'll take any of your versions. So I'm not so sure, again, you have to understand this goes against every fiber of my being as a designer. But at the same time, I think it's a fascinating territory for young architects to start to think about it. And this is something that architecture needs to evolve, or what we consider, whatever, architecture with capital A, or the project, or thesis, or whatever it is. I think that there is something interesting about that possibility. And now, I think then you're going to have to come with your rules, how to curate it, how you establish hierarchy, how you define the choreography. I think it will be a mistake if you present all of them as equals, like they all have the same value. I mean, I think it has to come with some other mechanisms for you to establish hierarchy, but maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong about that too, and that maybe it's part of my very old way of thinking about this.
I tend to
like,
agree. Yeah.
I like the trees a lot. I mean, mostly because they're things that we don't typically think of as designed, but that architects have to design all the time. And either whether it's choosing from CAD blocks or drawing in the background of a drawing, but they're things that we don't typically think of as the primary site of production in a way. But I mean, Sylvia's just done a bunch of work on this, but if you look at the sort of array of hundreds of years of history, you can see a variation in the types of trees designed by architects and variation across even species in relation to the architecture. If you look at Frank Gehry's models of trees, they actually look kind of like his buildings, and that's not consistent. And trees are doing a lot of work in drawings. And I guess I wonder if there's a way to begin to maintain the array of like sites of interest of architectural production, but approach each one with the mentality of approaching the problem of designing a tree in a way. So I guess there's like a human head, which has been a site of design in architecture, not just like how to represent it, but like what should be the kind of like ideal and what do the variations kind of suggest. And that discourse has been caught up in very horrible things also. But I don't think that, I think like the question of hierarchy is important, but I also think the focus on things that are typically not considered sites of architectural production. So I don't think you want to have, or I don't know if you want to have a conversation about whether or not this like, maybe I can draw on this. Yeah. Like this thing in the middle is a good development, it has good proportions, or it's a good amount of variety or not, or whether or not like the composition of these are interesting, or whether they're set in the right scene. I mean, I think one of the issues I'm having is like it's unclear where design is located in each of these little projects. And I mean, your interest in the way you presented it was in images, but I think we can put that aside for just a second and to focus on each of these as like design exercises in a way, or each one has a kind of mini thesis where you're relocating sites of design. Perhaps one's about composition to challenge these like things that have been upheld for a very long time, and maybe each one has a little project where you're trying to kind of come to terms with, to better understand dominant discourses in a way to resituate them. And the reason why I kind of went to the tree in the beginning is because there hasn't really been necessarily a theory of trees constructed by architects. I mean, historians have done a lot of work after the fact to look at the work that they've done, and Sylvia's written about it and curated shows most recently. But like, I guess I wonder what work your thesis can do to begin to kind of open up these various conversations. So maybe you look at these like after the review and you try to kind of figure out which conversations, like dominant discourses, like things we associate it with the discipline that's built on like very Eurocentric principles, which conversations each of these little projects participates in ways that you can begin to deconstruct or question the like very kind of the tenets on which each one of these things is built, as a way to kind of shift our understanding or open up new conversations, or to say actually some of these conversations are highly problematic. And I think that that's a very worthwhile thing to be working on right now, and like some work that kind of needs to be done in architecture. It's hard, and like, but I don't think it's enough to kind of just put them all out there and expect something to come out of it.
I want to try out a thought, like like what would typically happen at this stage, right? Like we would look at the tile and go, okay, what are the common themes here? And then, okay, that's the common theme. Now that's what's going to be your project, that one thing, right?
Yeah.
Right? So like, it's almost like division where like you're doing, looking for the common denominator, right? Like another strategy, I mean, this is gonna be a weird arithmetic analogy. Another way we could do it is, okay, let's get rid of all the ones we don't like and just keep the ones we like, which is subtraction, right?
Mm.
Then there's, okay, the ones we like, do more of it, addition. But maybe you go in the direction of multiplication, where you take things in the grid and just multiply it against another one and just keep increasing, you know, and just have enormous amounts to the point where at the end, your grid becomes almost like little pixels where it's almost gone, you know, because there are just so many, but it proceeds by a kind of multiplication logic. So I'm thinking like in the most maybe abstract way to how to achieve other forms of coherence that we, I think, most commonly do common denominator, you know, in a design process.
And I think that's a good point. The one thing that I would like to get rid of in the way that you present this is the notion of a square, the image occupying a single square. If you want to present this as a tile, as tiles of just different image, I'll be curious to know how you curate that border between them and the scale of them, and if there's some kind of object or something that helps the transition from one to the next, or if they holistically create something larger than just a single image. One criteria that, for example, I can think of is that knowing how proxy renders work, they rely on repetition, right? So trees are very good at proxy rendering because just by rotation, you can actually remove the notion of repetition, right? Rotation and scale. So in your images, I can, like, if I could start doing axis, I would do axis on the ones that I know that they're twin indexical, the way that they were created through proxy rendering, in which the object is always repeated and it only changes scale. So anything that has symmetry in your things, like the little canisters, is not in my mind, it's not a good proxy model because it doesn't allow it to actually operate in repetition. So the same thing with like texture, the way that you're thinking about texture architecture is anything that it looks symmetrical or have by symmetries is not a good way of thinking about, because that's the way that texture tiling and surface shaders operate, right? So there's certain objects that work really well, and trees are one of them. And I think you can come up with more that actually just through scale and rotation avoid repetition, and you start removing yourself from the operation of proxy rendering and texture, what you call texture architecture, things like that. But it is really good. But I do think that thinking of the line or the tiles differently might way away of what Hernan was trying to emphasize about how you curate the work. There's categories obviously that are happening. There's like landscapes, there's like sci-fi, kind of like utopian or dystopian structures. There's like very conventional kind of cities and things like that. So you might be able to categorize all of this in different, maybe 10 or more categories that you can start like judging them right inside their own category, and then you're able to kind of compile them and compositionally arrange them in a way that makes sense collectively.
I think if I can pick up on this idea of repetition a little bit, and I think these comments have been sort of like brought up, or maybe like I'm kind of like responding to them in real time as well, to the earlier question of like, you know, which ones would you select out of like the grid of options that we have right now? Like, I think for me, some of the ones that I'm more curious about are the ones that have objects situated with a background almost. So like things that are situated on a site of some sort. And I wonder if this, and maybe perhaps this is a little bit too niche, so take it with a grain of salt, but I wonder if this idea of proxying, so using using a proxy render method to generate a kind of like background or a site or trees and so on, something that, you know, we've been sort of like working with for a while now, replicating that type of method and generating some of these other forms, which I'm assuming is what's happening in the examples that have kind of like repetitive elements over and over again, that almost seem kind of like not cellular, but you do see the kind of like the repetitive component in it. So I wonder if your setup could be such that it could start with that, how you kind of utilize this sort of this kind of like proxy-based rendering methodology to generate a background and an architectural proposal at the same time, and sort of move from that, because maybe like a starting point might be like a little bit helpful in terms of setting up your categories. But then I also I sent this screenshot, this very strange screenshot. It's a screenshot from the movie Predator from 1987, which reminded me of this idea of repetition, in terms of repetition. It's basically, the screenshot is of the Predator, who they have the ability to be camouflaged within the trees. But this idea of this kind of like visual effect of repetition, there's the first repetition, which is the background, which is the trees and leaves and like whatever. And then the secondary component of it is a sort of like centrifugal or centripetal kind of repetitive sort of like lines of the background to represent that 3D object. And all of a sudden I kind of like start to think through that the 3D object as something that is made of the thing that belongs like in the background. So I think that to me would be one sort of like potential like starting point in terms of how you start to define your rule sets and your categories. But I mean, I think you're in a really fantastic position in terms of the midpoint of the thesis semester, in the sense that you have a lot to draw from.
Caleb, I'm also wondering if there's a way to use proxies in the way that you present the work, like maybe as a template in After Effects or Twitch or something, where you use proxies not only in your renders, but in how it catalogs itself as well. That was just one thought.
All right, interesting discussion. Thank you. We have our final student, Giovanna, and then we're done.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks, Ken.
Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so hi, everybody. My name is Giovanna, and I'm going to present a little bit of how I was planning to present my miniatures. So my thesis explores basically the relationships that people have between between their space in like large events and like festivals, music festivals, and public manifestos. My idea is more like to discuss how people use these larger spaces and the use of like large crowds and in large events and concerts. So I wanted to take as a reference the 60s movements, like the in a way of comparing to music, art, and especially in architecture, where you have groups like Archigram and Super Studio discussing about how different dystopias are made, or different utopias in relationship to space. And let me think more. And I wanted to use that as a way of organizing in how a Woodstock festival, for example, would be made in the 21st century. So I decided to take an area in Songdo, close to the Incheon area in South Korea, as a way of representing it for the use of the K-pop industry and the K-pop culture with the Korean culture itself. And the idea was inside of the project was to take this area into a very large festival. The area is about 2.5 square miles, which is pretty large, but once I compare to other festivals like Lollapalooza and Coachella, the size was pretty acceptable. So as a way to organize this large area, I started designing with a few stains in a paper. So I even put it here, a few tests. Not sure if it's possible. Can everybody see these tests?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thanks. So those are a few tests that I made inside of in the paper, and I decided to, after testing 2 zebras, to make a few landscapes. The last one seemed to be more more interesting compared to the others. So I started putting this this landscape inside of the terrain, and use 100 by 100 feet areas with the structure in a huge glass, in a huge glass structure. So that's how I started organizing how this area would be, with a political / musical festival that still doesn't have a title yet, but I am basically working on it while I am working inside of the program of the festival. I guess that's it.
It's like a K-pop Woodstock.
Yeah, like a K-pop Woodstock.
Can we see the tests a little bit more zoomed in?
Sure.
Maybe fit to width, and then you can scroll through.
This. Yeah, so I basically used black and white acrylic paint and started staining to paper. It's just very large file, so I'm sorry if it is very slow.
Giovanna, you want to say something about the political agenda of the manifesto you were really into?
The political agenda?
The BPS thing.
Yeah, I actually didn't know if I was supposed to say that, to be honest, because I didn't know if
I think it would be helpful, you know.
Yeah, so there is this this book called BTS Art Revolution, where the author basically uses the BTS. There is a famous K-pop group, as and the relationship between this Korean group with their fandom, that's called an army. They have this relationship that breaks the hierarchy, and it gets it compares to a rhizome. So it's not like a structure it's a structure that is entirely connected between BTS and its fandom.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it. I discovered this through Giovanna. You know, she's like, hey, you should check this out. And it's like Deleuzean critique brought to the K-pop phenomenon, arguing that K-pop is a kind of Deleuzean rhizomatic political phenomenon. That is really weird. I never would have expected that connection.
Those are basically the tests. I'll just zoom out a little bit more. That will help a little bit more. Yeah.
So are we supposed to look at these in terms of maybe, just to kind of clarify, are we supposed to look at these as more like abstract representations of interventions of the site conditions, or is this more of a diagram for a formal manipulation of the site?
I think it can be a bit of both, but mostly as a way of having a more organic idea of how to represent a different landscape. So if you see a landscape from very large scale, that's the goal that I was trying to achieve. You can even see a few tests that I made that didn't work out that great. Like the ones on the top, I personally didn't see them as, in the end, as interesting landscapes. If you see them here, those are tests that I personally didn't think I achieved. But if you see a bit more in the bottom, they seem much more similar to a landscape compared to others.
I think like if you want to look at them as like kind of like diagrammatic, then I would say, and I don't know which ones, maybe like a good question to ask is like which ones are your favorite and why, but then, because I guess like if we're looking at them from a diagrammatic point of view, when I think of the sort of nested conditions of organization or rhizomatic conditions per se, I think of like Thomas Arasano's filament works, for instance, and how is how they move away from a kind of centralized network and sort of go towards clustered conditions, right? So in that sense, you have the whole range here from like those studies at the very top, which are much more, they don't have kind of like areas of intensity per se, like I would call them, like the ones that more towards the bottoms do. So I think, I think basically what I'm trying to ask is, if we were to read them as diagrams, I think that's very different from reading them as kind of like abstract representations of, like, basically, I guess my question is like, is this more of a diagram for you because you are thinking through a manifesto, or is it actually something that you're thinking through in terms of like formal and like a formal and visual thesis?
I think it's more of the first, as a diagram of organization, from my point of view.
Okay. I'm going to mute for a second because I have a loud train that goes by. But
okay. Yeah, so I think I would see it as more of a diagram organization inside of it. Just like when you see a landscape, you see a very large portion, and they do have a few organizations. I would say it can be related as a diagrammatic point.
And do you think that these kinds of like clusters, or the particular areas that you're creating through this kind of diagram, is this something that could be kind of translated to a way of occupying that space during a festival, for instance? Or how do you see that sort of transition? Or is that transition even important?
I think the transition itself is indeed important in a way, but I think it depends on how people might use it, because that is something that is also a bit relative. At least that is something that I have been facing a bit of a challenge inside of while I was organizing the program itself, because when I made the landscape, it gives a lot of mountains around the white areas, and then the areas, the darker areas were the ones that became kind of like the corridors, the bigger areas, the spaces where people are going to occupy. So I think that is something that I still facing a bit of a challenge, I would say.
So in that case, then I would recommend the problem that you propose, or that you pose to us, is in a way to think about this through, I would say, or the way that I'm thinking through it is a kind of compositional strategies, kind of like plan view compositional strategies through the lens of a decentralized type of network that then relies on other types of semi-centers almost that create their own kind of like cluster conditions. And that's a compositional strategy that also sort of can help break down a larger area like this one, for instance. I think that might be like an interesting thesis, but then in that sense, I think then this kind of like abstraction, or the kind of like expressiveness of the studies that you have are not necessary to talk about that kind of diagram. But if you want to pose the question, I guess like I would say like you have to make a decision whether or not you want to pose the question as a kind of good composition versus bad composition, or a kind of like beautifully rendered out or painted type of landscape versus one that is not as beautiful, or some other type of like qualitative adjective associated to it. And I think I think I would say you need to make that decision so that we can then kind of relate and understand and see how we can talk about the project.
Thanks.
I'll jump into this one. I'm still not sure what you're doing, Giovanna. I was trying to pay attention and
it's okay. It's my idea is to design a festival that is both political and musical, basically.
And you're setting up the stage for that to take place through the
Yes. The idea is to set up stages, is to set up a lot of things inside of the area.
And when you claim a festival to be political, in what aspect is it political?
In a way of making, you know that recently there's been a lot of revolutionary protests, like for the youth and everything. Just like in the 60s, there was the Woodstock Festival that was as a movement of counterculture. That is basically the aspect that I want to pursue with this festival, but using the K-pop movement as a tool for that.
I mean, as a proposition, I think it's interesting, but in general, any kind of like social political movement that tries to raise awareness into a specific topic doesn't rely on a designated site, because a lot of its power rely on being able to occupy different areas of cities or towns or whatever neighborhoods, right? So the part of the movement relies on its occupancy of areas that they don't belong, are not designated for them. So that's kind of strange. I think creating a definition of an area for political protest movement is strange. I think it's easier for you to think of how you design kind of like the transition of the events that happen in relationship to K-pop and a political movement as it transgresses through a city or to a town, right? So how actually you can create kind of like tools or architectural elements that help for these things to take place and are more adaptable than trying to constrain them or corral them into a designated, delineated area. So I don't know, that's the part that I'm having a little bit of a hard time. I understand why you're doing it as a way to set up a stage, but it kind of goes against the notion of creating a political or revolutionary kind of notion of people coming together and then trying to convey a different kind of message, or trying to kind of exert some kind of push against a certain power. Is that fair to say, or?
Yeah,
or...
that I understand your point on that. I guess the idea was more just like the Hieronymus Bosch's paintings that are like absolutely messy with a lot of people, with like thousands of people. That was an idea that I was planning to make it similarly. I don't know if this can be an interesting reference, but
yep.
Giovanna, can you put on the other image for a second?
Sure, definitely.
I mean, that's just process stuff, so
yeah,
I don't know if
yeah.
it's that relevant. I guess the thing that stands out the most for me at this moment is there are no buildings, or what we would normally call buildings anyway. There's only infrastructure, landscape, and people. You know? So I think you're going to have to find a way to articulate a little bit what that has to do with the politics.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not enough to say it's political. I think you actually have to state what the politics are exactly. Like,
mm-hmm.
What is it for and what is it against? You know, and that's that. I think that's the thing to get specific about. So
mm-hmm.
like Woodstock was this famous revolutionary event, and then I guess we have more recent versions like Burning Man, you know. But I've always found it interesting that these kinds of events had a kind of anxious relationship to what we call buildings, you know, like as though almost like having architecture is antithetical, you know, to the politics. So like Woodstock, there was just farmland,
yeah.
and then just put up a stage and people just sit anywhere, you know. So
mm-hmm.
I think it is interesting that maybe like it is a project about denial of architecture in some way, which is a type of architecture too, ironically. So I think you're gonna have to find a way to talk about all of this stuff.
Okay.
Why is there a grid? What's the grid?
Which grid?
The big grid.
Oh, Yeah, it's not showing exactly here. If you zoom in, you can see it, but I only found out this after rendering a lot. Not sure if it's possible to see it.
I meant like the big kind of the trusses, the truss frame and the design and the other rendering.
Full page.
Yeah.
Those are here.
Yeah.
What about it?
What is it?
Those are basically a few details of how the structure on the floor it would be if it was full of glass. Basically, because if I put something that is just a concrete thing, it would be pretty weird. So the way that I wanted to make it was referencing to I forgot the name, Super Studios collages, like that.
Yeah, I mean, I for sure get that. I don't know, though, that that's necessarily the discourse that you want to, I don't know, participate in. If I think that because, like to David's point, because there's not much, let's say, there's not much built stuff in this project at the moment, and there's a lot of work about what a lot of ideas about what potentially could happen here, and how events might transpire or not transpire. The choice to have a grid as a regulating device, or structure, or a way to produce like a horizon or a vanishing point, or I don't know. That's one of the only things in these images, and I wonder what its role is. And it seems like it needs to have, if it's going to remain, it doesn't need to be a grid. It could be a kind of less ordered structure. It could be a space frame, a less regulated space frame. It could be something that kind of just like deals with the ground in a much different kind of way, as opposed to imposing a system kind of over it. And I guess it's one of the only things there. I think you should, if it's going to remain, you should have a kind of theory about it. If it's about efficiency, or like these are like regular, easily constructed elements that can be deployed kind of anywhere or across any kind of landscape in a way. I mean, I think that if it's about kind of no specific place, or I don't know, the relationship to the landscape, or the imposition of a kind of like more legible system on an irregular thing. I just think there needs to be some reason why it's there, especially if there's very few like designed things in here. And does it always need to stay the same size? Is it a way to begin to kind of like open up space or condense space, or like, you know, similar, like if Woodstock didn't really have anything except for an open field, and and that was enough, you know, people brought their own stuff. And I mean, here, this is sort of borrowing from the language of like stage armature stuff. I don't know exactly what they're called, but it's for me reminiscent of it. Or there's this, the triangular frames that they use to make and erect sort of stages and platforms at these huge events. And maybe that's something to begin to, you know, pull into a little bit more, to begin to produce another kind of platform here. Maybe one that's above instead of below, or I don't really know what the relationship is between this and the ground below, but I think it just needs a kind of, it can't be an arbitrary thing. It can't just be because Super Studio did it, although I appreciate it.
Yeah. I agree that there's probably a lot of placeholders here that are going to have to be substituted eventually for something else, you know. But maybe one angle to this, as I've been trying to get up to speed on the K-pop phenomena, which I knew nothing about until I met you, Giovanna, is that there are two sides to this. Like one thing that I'm becoming aware of is the function of drugs in the 60s in the counterculture to produce collective ecstatic experience is more recently been transitioning where the drugs are being substituted with technology. Like Instagram, social media, or just various new ways of aggregating experience collectively becomes weirdly a kind of substitution for that ecstatic experience. And but at the same time, there are two sides to this because there's still drugs, you know, in K-pop, and you know, but it's not used as some kind of instrument like it was being used in the 60s, right? So I think the box trusses and the cell phone tower, it's just a kind of temporary placeholder, I think, for some other device for collective ecstatic experience, which still needs music, I guess, and still needs an event space. So I think these are the things you got to figure out a way to take more possession of, you know, moving forward, to really start making an argument for what type of political space you're designing. Like no pot, but you got Wi-Fi, you know, or no LSD, but you have social media, you know, and just see if you can formulate an argument in that way.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I guess we're at the end of the day. 3 minutes ahead of schedule. Any final comments from our guests for our students before we wrap up for today?
I think it's really good to see the range of techniques that everyone's using. And it's also, I just find it really comforting to see the amount of work that's being produced considering the current environment out there and COVID and everything that's going on. And I don't know, it's heartening. And I'm very curious, of course, where everything ends up, but I think there's a ton of potential and the range is great to see.
Thank you for coming.
Similarly, it's like super refreshing always to be in these reviews looking at kind of like the diversity and kind of how far students are willing to push their ideas. If anything, I encourage us to push even further to make things a little bit stranger always. For those students, it's good to evaluate at this moment. You have a few weeks. I mean, you don't have that much left to evaluate what your strengths are and focus on that and try to kind of share all the things that you know that are not going to go anywhere. We tend to hold on to things that we don't really need to make the projects. Communicate the ideas that you have. So it's a good moment now to kind of like self-evaluate and say, I really don't want to go this route. These are my strengths. This is what my thesis is about. I'm just going to focus on it. But super interesting to see all the work. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, I thought, oh my God, the work was amazing, really accomplished. And I think it's important and an opportunity for everybody to for sure think now about the final presentation and to know that you sort of know the size and the format. It's going to be a little laptop screen, and to really begin to take advantage of the fact that like your projects are probably going to circulate more quickly and more readily than other projects in the other like typical thesis presentations that rely on the wall, and it's hard to move outside of the institution, and yours immediately will be kind of like on the internet right away and are going to be formatted to circulate through these channels where they get visibility and get legs. And so I think it's a really great opportunity to begin to think about that sort of final presentation, how you want to orchestrate it, and what other kind of media you need to support the larger idea. And like whether it's, I guess I would just say that like the PDF is hard generally. I'm sure you know from spring semester, like PDFs are hard to follow, and the things that are formatted for, let's say like linear consumption as opposed to typical things where you are able to see kind of everything at once, like a Miro board, are, I think, much more easy to access and have some strength behind them. So thinking about the media and the format and circulation and consumption is this is a great moment to do it. And whether, I mean, I would make a website. I would know that your projects are going to be out there right away.
Yes, to the website. I will pick up on that. Cargo Collective has a free studio promotion, so everyone can have a website for free. I think it's a really powerful tool because you can upload your 3D models as well, and I think that can really help, not just in terms of your final review, but also sort of communicating with one another too, as you're all, I'm assuming, in your own individual spaces. There aren't two people sharing one screen, as I see, but this was really, really fantastic work. Thanks for having me.
It's super cool to have like an alumni kind of thing, you know? I mean, other schools have an alumni weekend. Maybe we make this a regular thing. Huh?
No, I wanted to thank all of the guests, not only the one in this panel, but everybody else. I think this was a fantastic idea of Florencia to do the first review with a whole alum group of critics. I think many of you's thesis is still fresh in your memory and the process of it. So I really think for the current students in thesis, I think to get that perspective is super, super useful, and probably I think it's incredibly insightful because I think all of you talk with that in mind, which is different than just judging the project as face value, but really to understand what is going on. And then, again, this is still in many ways, many of the projects are in the infancy in the process. It's only roughly months or so into the trajectory. So I think this was absolutely blessed to have this conversation.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, Rachel.
Oh, I was just going to say to the students, don't be afraid of producing final stuff too early. Like, you can do it now and then something else will come, you know. I sort of got to a finishing point and then added another thing in the last month. So, you know, you don't have to wait.
All right.
Yeah, and build your teams now. Get your helpers. It's crucial. Going back to the OMA comment to an extent.
That's an old SCI-Arc tradition, right? Recruiting your peers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. Interesting conversation.
Hey, well, are the alumni? Are you guys going to the?
Oh, we have a party coming up.
I thought it's in an hour, no?
Is it
It's
in
a
an hour?
party at 6. It's a party at 6.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's like in an hour.
See you
Yeah.
then.
All right,
Thank
see
you.
guys later.
Congratulations.
Well done, everyone.
I'm excited to see the
Bye,
final
everyone.
projects. Yep.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.